November 15, 1962, 11:47 p.m., the penthouse sat on the 47th floor of a building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, overlooking Central Park. From the windows, you could see the entire city spread out like a kingdom. That's exactly how the five men in that room saw it, not as a city, as a kingdom. And they were the kings. Vincent Gigante was 56 years old, standing by the window with a glass of scotch in his hand, watching the lights of the city twinkle below. He was the underboss of the Genovese family, the most powerful family in New York. He had a reputation for being calculated, intelligent, almost prescient in the way he could predict moves 3 steps ahead. Men called him the Chin because of a small dimple on his chin. But they also called him that because the word on the street was that his brain was so sharp it could cut through anything. Carmine Gambino sat at the head of the mahogany table. He was 60 years old, the boss of the Gambino family, arguably the most powerful organization in the entire country. He had iron gray hair, eyes that never blinked, and a voice that could make powerful men tremble. He wasn't a flashy man. He didn't need to be. His power was so complete that he could afford to be quiet. He wore a simple suit, simple tie, simple watch. Everything about him screamed that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Next to Carmine was Joe Bonanno, the boss of the Bonanno family. He was 57, with slicked-back black hair and the kind of controlled aggression that came from being in the game for 40 years. Bonanno had survived wars that had killed dozens of other bosses. He had a scar that ran from his right eye to his jaw, a souvenir from a fight in his youth. He wasn't afraid of anything or anyone. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Across from Bonanno sat Philip Rastelli, boss of the Colombo family, and next to him was Gaetano Lucchese, the boss of the Lucchese family. These were the five families. These were the men who controlled organized crime in New York City, which meant they controlled organized crime in America, which meant they had their hands in legitimate and illegitimate business from Wall Street to the waterfront to every neighborhood in the city. They controlled politicians. They had judges in their pockets who would make rulings favorable to their interests. They had police officers on their payroll who would look the other way when their trucks rolled through, when their operations ran, when their money moved. They owned construction companies that built the buildings of Manhattan. They controlled the unions that ran the docks. They owned nightclubs and restaurants where politicians and celebrities would come, where the bosses could see and be seen, where deals were made in back rooms and whispered conversations. The heroin trade was what had brought them together tonight. Pure white powder from the Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia. Morphine fields in Laos, processing labs in Thailand, smuggling routes through French Indochina and then across the Pacific. The five families had connections everywhere. They bought direct from the producers, cut the product themselves, distributed it through networks of dealers, and made profits that seemed to multiply endlessly. The math was simple. A kilo of pure heroin cost $5,000 in Bangkok. They cut it with other powder, stretching it 5 times. 5 kilos worth of product. They sold each kilo to mid-level distributors for $30,000. That was $150,000 per kilo of original product. The money was insane. The margins were incredible. And the demand was endless. Poor neighborhoods, rich neighborhoods. It didn't matter. Heroin addiction didn't discriminate. Once someone used it, they needed it. It was reliable income in a way that few things were. The problem was Harlem. Vincent Gigante turned from the window and sat down at the table. He poured himself another drink from the crystal decanter. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "we still have the Harlem situation to address. The Castellano connection in Brooklyn is pushing for a decision. They want to know if we're moving forward or pulling back." Carmine Gambino leaned back in his chair. His fingers were steepled together, and he was looking at the ceiling as if the answer might be written there. "Bumpy Johnson," he said simply. It wasn't a question. It was the statement of a problem that had no solution. Bumpy Johnson? The name had become something of a legend in the criminal underworld, and for good reason. He was 56 years old, a black man who had risen through the ranks of Harlem crime over the past 20 years until he was the undisputed king of that neighborhood. The Italian families respected power, and Bumpy Johnson had power, real power. The kind of power that couldn't be quantified in dollars or measured in the number of men you had working for you. "He's been blocking us for 3 years now," Joe Bonanno said, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. "Every time we try to move in, every time we try to establish a connection, he shuts it down. We had two guys just try to set up a small operation on 125th Street, and within 2 days, they'd been beaten so badly they couldn't walk. Nobody would say who did it, but everyone knew it was Bumpy's people. Because he doesn't allow heroin in Harlem, Gaetano Lucchese said. He was the quietest of the 5 bosses, the one who spoke rarely, but when he did, people listened. That's his rule. No hard drugs in his neighborhood. It's an absurd rule, Philip Rastelli said. It costs us millions. Harlem is one of the biggest drug markets in the city. The neighborhood is dense, the demand is high, and we've got the supply. We should be making a fortune there. Instead, we're blocked by some old black gangster with a moral code. Carmine Gambino raised his hand slightly, and the room went silent. Bumpy Johnson isn't just some old black gangster, Carmine said quietly. Bumpy Johnson is a man who controls more loyalty with no formal organization than we control with 5 families and thousands of soldiers. He's a man who can walk into a police station and speak to officers who respect him. He's a man whose word is absolute in his territory. And he's a man who has, so far, made his rules stick against all of our efforts to break it. So, what are you saying? Vincent Giganti asked, that we should give up, that we should accept his no? I'm saying we should understand what we're dealing with, Carmine replied. Bumpy Johnson is not like the other drug dealers we've pushed out of their territories. He's not in it purely for money. He has a code. He believes heroin is poison, and he's willing to fight to keep it out of his neighborhood, even against the 5 families. That kind of conviction is dangerous. You can't buy it, you can't intimidate it, you can't kill it, because there are always more people willing to die for that code. Then we kill him, Bonanno said simply. It was the solution to most problems in their world. Someone was in the way. You removed them permanently. We have the resources. We can make it happen quietly. By the time anyone realizes what happened, we'll already have our operation set up in Harlem, and then what? A voice came from the doorway. Every head in the room turned. Every man's hand instinctively moved closer to the weapons they had concealed beneath their jackets. 3 bodyguards stood at the entrance to the penthouse, their guns drawn, but not pointed at anyone yet. Behind them, walking through as if he owned the place, was Bumpy Johnson himself. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that must have cost at least $500, a silk tie, the color of wine, and polished black shoes that reflected the light from the chandeliers. His hair was graying at the temples, and his face had the kind of lined map of experience that comes from living through decades of violence, struggle, and difficult choices. But his eyes were the most striking thing about him. They were clear and intelligent and completely without fear. Bumpy walked past the 3 bodyguards without even looking at them. His hand was raised, not in surrender, but in a gesture of peaceful authority. The bodyguards lowered their guns. It wasn't that they wanted to, it was that they had been trained, their entire careers, to respond to a certain kind of presence. And Bumpy Johnson had that presence in abundance. He walked to the head of the table, to the chair that Carmine Gambino was sitting in. Carmine didn't move. Bumpy placed his hand on the back of the chair and looked down at him. For a moment, the 2 most powerful men in their respective organizations stared at each other. Then Carmine slowly stood up and moved to a different seat. Bumpy sat down at the head of the table and looked around the room at the 5 most dangerous men in America. He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had just done something that everyone had said was impossible. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "I think we need to have a real conversation about who actually runs this city." Vincent Giganti's hand was still near his gun. "How did you get past our security?" he asked, his tone conversational, but his eyes deadly. "The same way I get past everything," Bumpy replied. "I walked, and nobody stopped me because they understood, on some level, that I would probably keep walking whether they tried to stop me or not. And they valued their lives more than they valued whatever bonus they were being paid for the night shift." Joe Bonanno laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You're very confident for a man who just walked into a room with 5 men who could have you killed before you took another breath." "That's true," Bumpy nodded. "You could have me killed. You have the guns, the men, the resources. You could have my entire organization dismantled within a week. That's absolute fact. But here's the question, Joe. What would you be gaining? Because after you killed me, after you took over Harlem, after you brought your heroin into the neighborhood, something would change. The community would turn against you. not overnight, but slowly, systematically. Mothers would inform on your dealers to the police. Workers on the docks would suddenly remember things they'd seen, things they'd written down, things they could tell the feds if the price was right. Building superintendents would become less helpful about letting your couriers use their buildings. Doctors would start reporting more overdose deaths. Every single system that you've built your power on would start grinding more slowly, becoming less efficient, less profitable. You'd win the battle and be left holding a neighborhood that bleeds money instead of making it. Carmine Gambino was studying him with the intensity of someone analyzing a chess position 10 moves ahead. You said you wanted to have a real conversation, Carmine said, so have it. But understand that your time here is a courtesy, and courtesies can end very quickly. Bumpy leaned back in the chair that had just been occupied by the most powerful man in the room. He looked completely comfortable, as if he'd been sitting in this chair his entire life. In 1962, the five families control almost everything in New York, Bumpy began. You have legitimate businesses, construction, unions, import-export, restaurants, nightclubs. You have illegal businesses, gambling, loan sharking, theft rings, prostitution. You have politicians and judges and police officers in your pockets. You have an organization that's sophisticated, intelligent, and ruthless. On paper, you own New York City. That's not paper, old man Rastelli said. That's reality. It's reality everywhere except one neighborhood, Bumpy continued, as if he hadn't been interrupted. And that one neighborhood costs you millions because you can't break it. You can't force your way in. You can't buy your way in. You can't intimidate your way in. And so, you sit here, the most powerful organization in America, frustrated by one neighborhood that refuses to accept your heroin. Your neighborhood, Bonanno said, his voice tight, your rule, which is why you're either going to fold it or we're going to remove the obstacle. Bumpy pulled a folder from his jacket. He slid it across the table to Carmine. Inside were photographs, crime scene photos, bodies, young people, old people, children, some bearing signs of overdose, some showing injuries from crime associated with addiction, some simply lying still, their eyes open and empty. These photographs are from 1961 and the beginning of 1962, Bumpy said quietly. They are from the 5 boroughs of New York, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, Staten Island, and Manhattan below 110th Street. These are people who died from heroin addiction or from crimes related to heroin addiction. Count them. Carmine opened the folder. He went through the photographs slowly, carefully. His face didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly. When he finished, he closed the folder and set it back on the table. 43, he said. 43, Bumpy repeated. Now, let me ask you something. How many of those people are from Harlem? Nobody answered. They all knew the answer was 0. I have a similar folder, Bumpy said. It shows every overdose death, every crime related to heroin addiction, every family destroyed by the drug in Harlem for the past 5 years. You know how many 3 people in 5 years? And one of those was an accident, a bad batch from someone smuggling from outside? The other 2 were people who brought heroin into the neighborhood against my rules, and paid the price for it. Giganti was studying Bumpy with the intensity of a scientist studying a fascinating specimen. You're not here to show us photographs, he said. It wasn't a question. No, Bumpy agreed. I'm here because I received word that you were having this meeting tonight. I'm here because I wanted you to understand something that I don't think you fully grasp. I'm not trying to protect Harlem from heroin because of morality. I'm not trying to protect Harlem from heroin because I suddenly found Jesus or developed a conscience. I'm protecting Harlem from heroin because a neighborhood that's addicted to heroin is a neighborhood that's unstable, that's poor, that's dysfunctional. And a dysfunctional neighborhood is hard to control. A stable neighborhood, on the other hand, a neighborhood where the people trust their leadership, where families stay intact, where young people have futures they can believe in. That neighborhood runs like a machine. That neighborhood generates money. That neighborhood is powerful. Lucchese leaned forward. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that the 5 families and I come to an understanding, Bumpy said. You continue your operations everywhere else. Every other neighborhood in New York, every other city, every country you have connections in, I'm not interfering with that. But Harlem remains clean. No heroin, no hard drugs. You respect my territory, and I make sure you don't have problems in my neighborhood. And what exactly do we get out of this arrangement? Bonanno asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. We lose millions in potential profit, and we get what, exactly? Bumpy stood up and walked to the window. He looked out over the city, at all the lights, at all the neighborhoods, at the sprawling empire of New York. When he turned back to face them, his expression was serious. "What you get is stability," he said. "You get a neighborhood that's stable, that has respect for rules, that has infrastructure that doesn't collapse. You get a place where your people can move money without interference, where you can operate without the constant friction of trying to maintain control against a population that resists you. You get contacts, you get information, you get an entire neighborhood that understands that there are rules and that those rules are worth following. That's not how business works." "Harlem is one neighborhood," Bumpy replied. "New York has 5 boroughs plus the surrounding areas. The United States has 50 states. The world has dozens of countries. You're obsessed with Harlem because I said no. If I had said yes from the beginning, you would have taken it and moved on to the next opportunity. You're chasing me because you can't have what you want, and that's ego, not business. Real businessmen don't chase markets that resist them. They go where the doors are open and the profit margins are clear." Vincent Gigante had been silent for the last few minutes, but now he spoke. "You're not worried we'll kill you? Right now, you're standing in a room with the 5 most powerful men in New York, and you're calmly proposing that we give up millions in profit, and you're not worried we'll just end this meeting by putting a bullet in your head?" Bumpy smiled slightly. It was the smile of a man who had thought through every angle, every possibility, every consequence. "I'm not worried," he said, "because I know something about power that you've apparently forgotten. Power isn't about the ability to destroy. It's about the ability to create consequences. Yes, you could kill me, but what happens next? My organization doesn't fall apart. My people don't scatter. If I'm killed by the 5 families, then Harlem becomes a war zone. My people will target every Italian operation in the city, every bookmaker, every loan shark, every drug dealer, every nightclub owner. It won't be a war you can win because my people know Harlem better than your people know anything. They know every corner, every building, every face. They'll be fighting in territory they own, and you'll be fighting in territory that resists you." "You're threatening us," Bonanno said, his hand moving closer to the gun in his jacket. "No," Bumpy said calmly. "I'm explaining consequences. There's a difference. A threat is emotional. Consequences are logical. I'm showing you that the logical outcome of killing me is worse for you than the logical outcome of accepting my proposal." Carmine Gambino had been silent for most of this exchange, listening, calculating. Now he stood up and walked to the window, standing next to Bumpy. The 2 men looked out over the city together. When Carmine spoke, his voice was quiet, almost meditative. "I've been running the Gambino family for 8 years, he said. "In that time, I've consolidated power in a way that my predecessors never could. I've made this organization more profitable, more stable, more secure than it's ever been. And do you know how I did it? Not by fighting every battle, not by insisting on having every market, not by proving that I'm the strongest. I did it by understanding that real power is about controlling the most important things and letting other people have the less important things. That's the secret. Most men spend their entire lives fighting for everything and end up with nothing because they're too tired and too damaged to enjoy it." He turned to face Bumpy. "You've apparently learned the same lesson." "How old are you?" 56, Bumpy replied. "And how long have you controlled Harlem?" 20 years. "Since the early 1940s when numbers running was the main business. I've adapted as things changed." Carmine nodded slowly. "You're a businessman, not a gangster. That's why you've survived this long. That's why you're here talking to us instead of dead in an alley. You understand that profit comes from stability, and stability comes from having rules that people respect." He walked back to the table and sat down. He looked at the other 4 bosses, one by one. "Gentlemen, I think we should listen to what Bumpy Johnson has to say, because I think he's offering us something we don't have. He's offering us peace in a neighborhood that's been a thorn in our side for years. That's worth the profit we'd make from heroin sales. That's worth the trouble we'd save ourselves from not fighting in that neighborhood. You're saying we should say yes?" Bonanno looked incredulous. "Just like that? I'm saying we should recognize that there are different kinds of wealth," Carmine replied. "And sometimes the wealth we gain by not fighting is more valuable than the wealth we'd make by fighting. Bumpy Johnson has offered us a deal, a good deal, one that makes business sense, one that gets us something we need: stability and peace, while only costing us something we can get from 100 other places. That's a deal." He looked at Bumpy. "But I need to understand something. If we agree to this, if we let Harlem be clean, what prevents some other organization, some group we can't control, from flooding it with drugs and heroin? Nothing, Bumpy said honestly. If someone else tries, they'll face the same response they'd face from you. But I have a good relationship with most of the independent operators in New York. They understand that Harlem is off-limits, the same way they understand that certain parts of other neighborhoods are off-limits to them. It's understood, it's accepted. And if someone doesn't understand, well, I'll make sure they do. And what if we decide to break this agreement? Rostelli asked. What if we change our minds in 6 months, in a year, and decide that the profit from heroin is worth the trouble? Bumpy walked to the center of the room. He was facing all 5 of them now, standing in the middle of the most powerful men in America, and he didn't look small or intimidated. He looked like someone standing in his own living room. If you break the agreement, Bumpy said, his voice dropping lower, becoming more dangerous, then I will make sure that the federal government understands something. I will make sure that they understand that you have been moving drugs into a neighborhood despite the community's protests. I have friends in the FBI. I have judges who've worked with me. I have people who've accumulated evidence of your operations for years, just waiting for the word. If you break this agreement, that evidence gets delivered. Federal prosecutors will suddenly have files on decades of your crimes. Politicians who have worked with you will suddenly have reasons to distance themselves. Your operations will be investigated at levels you can't imagine. You have resources, yes, but the federal government has more. And they'll use them if given a reason. The room was completely silent now. The threat was clear, unmistakable, and devastating in its implications. Bumpy had just told them that if they violated the agreement, he would expose them to federal prosecution at a scale that could destroy their entire organization. Gigante was the first to speak. This is intimidation, he said. No, Bumpy corrected. This is insurance. Insurance that a business arrangement remains stable. You have insurance policies on your legitimate businesses. You have agreements that have teeth. This is the same thing. You're not intimidated by this because you have no intention of breaking the agreement. It only becomes a problem if you decide that you want to. Bonanno leaned back in his chair. His scarred face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. How do we know you have this kind of federal connection? How do we know you're not bluffing? Bumpy smiled. You don't, that's the point. If I showed you proof, then you'd know the limits of my connections. As it stands, you have to assume I'm not bluffing, because the downside of assuming I am is too high. That's how real power works. Joe, it's built on uncertainty, on the assumption that someone actually can do what they say they can do. Lucchese, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke. His voice was thin and reedy, but it carried weight. If we agree to this, he said, you need to understand something. Harlem becomes your responsibility. Any crime that happens there, any dealers from outside trying to come in, any trouble at all, that's your problem to solve. We don't want to hear about it. We don't want to be involved. You run your neighborhood like it's a completely separate entity. Understood, Bumpy said immediately. Harlem is my responsibility. I maintain order. I handle problems. The 5 families continue your operations everywhere else. It's clean separation. And you, Carmine said, standing up and extending his hand, are a man of your word. Bumpy took his hand. I am. I've been running Harlem for 20 years with nothing but my word and my reputation. I'm still here because people trust what I say. The handshake was firm, and it was witnessed by the other 4 bosses. It was an agreement, not a contract, not written down. Just a handshake between 2 men who understood that their word was their bond, that reputation was everything, that breaking an agreement was worse than losing money. Bumpy walked to the door. The bodyguards, who had been standing silently the entire time, opened it for him. He paused at the threshold and turned back to face the 5 most powerful men in America. Thank you, he said simply. Thank you for understanding that this was business, not ego. Thank you for recognizing that stability is worth more than profit in this particular case. The people of Harlem will benefit from this agreement. And so will you, even if you don't realize it for a few years. He left the penthouse. The elevator doors closed behind him, and he descended through the building, through the lobby, out into the streets of New York City. Back in the penthouse, Carmine Gambino returned to the head of the table. The 5 men sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Vincent Gigante spoke. Did we just get played? He asked. No, Carmine replied. We just got educated. There's a difference. Bumpy Johnson came in here and convinced us, without any weapons, without any army, without any formal authority, to give up potential profit in exchange for peace. He did it through intelligence, through understanding our motivations, through showing us that what he was offering was actually more valuable than what we were chasing. That's power. Real power. So, we're just allowing him to run a territory independently? Rostelli asked. We're accepting that there's a neighborhood in New York where the five families doesn't have control. We're accepting that there's a neighborhood where someone else has control and it's not worth fighting for, Carmine corrected. There's a difference. And if Bumpy Johnson runs Harlem so well that it becomes more stable and profitable for the rest of New York because there's no heroin epidemic spreading from there, then we're actually profiting from his independence even though we're not directly involved. Bonanno stood up and walked to the bar. He poured himself a drink. I didn't like that, he said flatly. I didn't like being in a room with someone who had that kind of nerve. I didn't like being threatened, even subtly. That's because you're used to being the most dangerous person in every room, Gigante said. And tonight, you weren't. That's a valuable reminder. It's important to know that there are people out there who are more intelligent than we are, more connected than we are, more capable in ways that our guns and our money can't touch. The meeting continued for another hour, but the important conversation was over. The five families had made their decision. Harlem would be left clean. The agreement with Bumpy Johnson would hold, and for the next 6 years, it did hold. Harlem remained free of heroin. The community thrived in ways that other neighborhoods didn't. Young people could grow up without addiction, destroying their futures, families remained intact, the crime rate was lower, the neighborhood was safer, and Bumpy Johnson's reputation grew beyond even what it had been. He became known not just as a successful crime boss, but as a man who had negotiated with the five families as an equal. A man who understood power at such a deep level that he could sit in a room with the most dangerous men in America and change the rules of the game. Other neighborhoods looked to Harlem and saw what was possible when you had strong leadership, when you had rules that people respected, when you had someone willing to fight for the community instead of against it. But Bumpy Johnson knew something that many people didn't understand. Power like that doesn't die with the person. It lives in the structures they build, the trust they create, the expectations they set. And when Bumpy died in 1968, when he collapsed from a heart attack at Wells' restaurant, the foundation he had built was strong enough to stand. However, that fragile balance didn't last. The order Bumpy Johnson had enforced through reputation, relationships, and carefully managed fear began to unravel almost immediately after his death. Within months, the agreements he had negotiated quietly collapsed. The five families, no longer restrained by Bumpy's presence or his authority in Harlem, moved in decisively. Heroin followed close behind. Without Bumpy, there was no single figure capable of enforcing boundaries or commanding enough respect to hold competing interests in check. The dealers who came next were different. They were younger, more reckless, and far less concerned with the long-term health of the neighborhood. They didn't respect Bumpy's memory, and they had no interest in preserving the rules he had imposed. Profit mattered more than stability. Speed mattered more than restraint. The barriers Bumpy had spent years building his personal relationships with Italian bosses, his understanding of street dynamics, his ability to negotiate rather than escalate, collapsed one by one. The informal agreements that had once kept heroin out of Harlem dissolved. Fear shifted from being a tool of control to a byproduct of chaos. Respect was replaced by competition, and competition quickly turned violent. By 1969, heroin was flowing freely into Harlem. What had once been tightly controlled or deliberately restricted now flooded the streets. By 1970, the damage was impossible to ignore. Addiction spread rapidly, touching nearly every block. Families that had survived decades of hardship were torn apart. Parents lost children, children lost futures. The drug didn't just destroy individuals, it hollowed out the social fabric of the neighborhood. By the mid-1970s, the transformation was complete. When Frank Lucas was arrested in 1975 for running one of the largest heroin operations Harlem had ever seen, it wasn't an anomaly, was the result of years of unchecked expansion. Harlem had become exactly what Bumpy Johnson had warned against. Crime rates soared. Violence became routine. Entire generations were caught in cycles of addiction and incarceration. The irony was brutal. Bumpy Johnson had been a criminal, but he had also been a regulator. He understood that some forms of order, however imperfect, could prevent far greater destruction. When that order disappeared, it wasn't freedom that followed, it was collapse. Harlem, once an island of relative stability amid chaos, became indistinguishable from other neighborhoods devastated by the drug trade. In the end, Bumpy's absence proved what his presence had quietly maintained. Power, when exercised with restraint and foresight, can limit damage. When that power vanished, the vacuum was filled not by better leadership, but by the most destructive forces imaginable. And that's what people often miss about Bumpy Johnson's legacy. They see the drug dealer, they see the gangster, they see the man who broke laws and controlled through violence and maintained power through fear. But what they don't see is the man who understood that real power is about creating structures that last, about building a community that's strong enough to resist forces much bigger than itself, about recognizing that sometimes the greatest victory is won without ever firing a shot. Bumpy walked into that penthouse alone because he understood something fundamental. The most dangerous thing in the world isn't a man with a gun or a man with an army. It's a man with an idea, a man with the respect of his community, a man who understands the system so well that he can negotiate with it, work with it, and maintain his own rules within it. He came out of that meeting with an agreement that changed the trajectory of an entire neighborhood. He did it through intelligence, through understanding human nature, through showing 5 powerful men that what he was offering was actually better for them than what they wanted. That's the lesson Bumpy Johnson taught that night in November 1962. Power isn't about violence, power is about understanding, and understanding is worth more than all the guns and money in the world. If this story helped you understand the difference between power built on brute force and power built on intelligence, patience, and negotiation, then take a moment to hit that like button. Stories like this aren't just about crime or history, they're about how influence really works, how systems are shaped, and how a single decision can ripple outward for decades. Subscribe to the channel, because next week we'll be telling the story of how Bumpy Johnson did something almost unthinkable, how he helped broker peace between the 5 families during a conflict that threatened to tear New York City apart, at a time when violence seemed inevitable, when egos were flaring and bloodshed felt unavoidable. Bumpy understood that survival didn't come from escalation. It came from leverage, relationships, and knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. You're not going to want to miss that story. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Do you believe Bumpy was right to protect Harlem by controlling how business was done? Or do you think he should have allowed everything to flow freely, even if it meant more chaos and violence? Was he a stabilizing force, or simply another power broker playing a dangerous game? These are questions worth thinking about because they go far beyond one man or one era. And don't forget to hit that notification bell. We've got many more stories coming about the genius of Bumpy Johnson, stories that reveal not just what he did, but how he thought. Stories that show how leadership in dangerous environments isn't about constant aggression, but about understanding incentives, fears, and human psychology. Because the most powerful man in the room is never the loudest one. It's never the one making threats or demanding attention. True power belongs to the person who understands how the system actually works, the one who sees the invisible connections, who knows where pressure can be applied quietly, and who understands which single thread to pull to make everything shift without chaos, without noise, and often without anyone realizing what happened until it's already done. That kind of power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. And that's what made Bumpy Johnson so dangerous, so effective, and so unforgettable.